Welcome to Holy Spirit Academy. I am Headmaster Lang. I'm very pleased to welcome the Holy Spirit Academy community and friends from St. Michael's to join us on our inaugural lecture here at Holy Spirit Academy. This is going to be a presentation on Can Good Catholics Believe in Evolution by Mr. J. Whalen. So let me tell you just briefly about Mr. Whalen if you don't know about him. Originally a native of Alexandria, he has some rowdy friends over there. No, it's basketball. He is now living in Buffalo with his wife Materialist, who's joining us tonight. And they have two beautiful children, Michael and Jane. He joined our faculty this year as a full-time math and science teacher, and he's also teaching a theology class that deals in part with this question. And his background is a Bachelor's of Arts in Liberal Arts from Thomas Aquinas College and a Master's in Science from the University of Montana. And speaking as someone who reviewed his transcripts when we were hiring him, he did exceptionally strong work in that graduate program. So I hope you enjoy this presentation on a topic that has a lot of contemporary importance and touches on perennial truths of our faith, which at Holy Spirit Academy here we are constantly trying to show the unity and the completeness of the integrity of our faith, which we will be learning about more tonight. So please help me warmly welcome Mr. Whalen.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Lang. You guys hear me all right? And thank you all for coming. It's a great honor and pleasure to speak here tonight. It's a little daunting to be the one who initiated this Holy Spirit lecture series. We're going to try to make this event a regular thing, which is great because the other teachers here are really exceptional. And they know their fields and they love sharing them with students, and I'm really glad to be a part of the team. So I was excited to receive this invitation from Mr. Lang to give a lecture on a topic related to our program at HSA. Partly because my job is to do whatever he needs me to do.
That's right.
But mostly because he said I could talk about anything that I thought was interesting. And so I settled on a question that I think is intrinsically fascinating, maybe even a little controversial, and particularly relevant to our modern secular culture, I'll say. Can good Catholics believe in evolution? With new atheists like Richard Dawkins and Bill Nye running around, evolution is often thought of as a sort of holy grail, like the last nail in the coffin of the old gods or something like that. The final case against God and His providence in the world. And at HSA, our motto is grounded in truth, prepared for life. And we'd be remiss in that mission if our graduates and community didn't have any wherewithal to meet those kinds of challenges. Any idea how to reconcile the doctrines of the faith with the discoveries of modern science? Now, scientists are known for following questions wherever the evidence leads. And I think most people who are humbly pursuing the truth would agree with that vision. Christ said that I am the way, the truth, and the life. And so as Christians, we're obviously enthusiastic about the truth, I hope. So why is it then that Christians would be so often push back against the advocates of evolution? There seems to be a common notion that we have to choose between the truth of the Scriptures and the truth the scientists are teaching us because we're told by the elites and the media that they're incompatible. And maybe that's not the case. Especially if you think about this, the truth of the Scriptures and the truth of science, when pursued humbly and honestly, both ultimately come from God, who's the source of all truth. And as John Paul II said, truth cannot contradict truth. I like to emphasize to my students that as Catholics, we do not embrace contradictions. Apparent contradictions are just that, apparent. When we come up against an apparent contradiction, there must be some distinction that we're missing, which can enhance our understanding of the truth. So, for example, some think that the Trinity is embracing a contradiction, because we say that God is three and one. Well, if the teaching was that God is three gods and one God, then they would be right. But there's a distinction that needs to be made. God is three in one respect, but one in another. He's three persons in one God. So going back to the evolution example, it could be that there is a contradiction and therefore evolution needs to be rejected. Or there could be a distinction that needs to be made that both resolves the apparent contradiction and deepens our understanding of the faith and its relation to science. So, what is that distinction? What I would like to do tonight is show you that evolution, correctly understood, does not eliminate God from a true view of the world. Contrary to what many new atheists and even some Christians think, there is, I believe, a perfectly reasonable and theologically sound way to reconcile the discoveries of science with the teachings of Scripture and the Church. In other words, the whole evolution versus creation dichotomy is just a red herring. It's a distracting question or difficulty that has no bearing on the conclusion we'll get to if we reason correctly. So, to see this, I first want to explain exactly what the word evolution means, which is important since the term is used to mean lots of different things. The broadest definition of evolution would be something this simple: the process of species changing over time. I think that the fact of this kind of evolution is indisputable. It's evident from all the different breeds of cats and cows, or chihuahuas and the Great Dane, that animals can vary greatly just through the process of selective breeding. And the same is true of plant crops. I suppose it's conceivable that something like that could happen in the wild, just given enough time. A slightly more refined definition of evolution could be species change into other species over time. Now, this statement may not seem likely on the face of it, but when one considers different species of animal that are very similar, like an African elephant and an Indian elephant, for example, the idea that one species could become another species given enough time seems like a possibility worth considering. This was Darwin's hypothesis about the different types of the famous finches from the Galapagos Islands. There's 15 kinds of finch there, species of finch there, and they vary somewhat in size and the shape of their beak. And so there are some finches that have really broad beaks that eat the nuts on the ground at certain seasons, and then there are finches that have smaller beaks that eat the insects and fruit on the cacti. And they're so similar in every other respect that Darwin hypothesized that these species descended from a single type of finch. And then, by the necessity to survive in slightly different environments, they adapted, changed, and eventually evolved into forms that were so different they became two new species. We've heard this story before. Now, neither of those first two senses seem to me too controversial. However, the definition I really want to focus on, and the one that I think people usually mean when they use the term evolution these days, would be this. Evolution is the process by which lower species develop into higher species as a result of purposeless causes. How is this accomplished? Well, the traits of species vary slightly over generations, and some of the traits are going to be more conducive to survival. The offspring lucky enough to inherit the advantageous variations will more likely survive, reproduce, and pass on those traits. And since there's only a limited number of resources that all these individuals are competing for, the traits useful for survival will become more pronounced as generations go by, while the animals with traits that are not useful will die out. And this process is what's called survival of the fittest, and it's the mechanism of natural selection. Further, as animals become better and better at survival, traits become so pronounced that they will become new species, like the finch, or the different kinds of elephants, or maybe even chimpanzees and men. Where was I? Here I am. And because among living things, there seems to be a gradation from the simple to the complex, from the single-celled organism to man, it's reasonable to assume that all species are just variations of simpler species that have developed over a sufficient period of time as a result of this natural selection. Finally, this explanation is self-sufficient, rests on the fewest principles, and to posit any other principles like purpose or a divine creator would be superfluous. This process is called evolution, and to distinguish this kind of evolution from the other ones, I will call it materialist evolution. Now, before we go on, notice the role of purpose in this account. Purpose has no role. It's not there. These changes are the result of purposeless causes. And I think this should strike the newcomer as odd, because when you look at nature, purpose seems almost self-evident. If you ask somebody on the street, what's the purpose of the eye? They'll say to see. What's the purpose of the ear? What's the purpose of teeth? What's the purpose of the polar bear's white fur? The answers to all these questions is pretty obvious. There also seems to be an amazing hierarchy in nature, where the less perfect creatures are ordered toward the higher creatures. So, for example, the grass is for the sake of the gazelle, and the gazelle is for the sake of the lion, and so on. In a recent science class, my students and I were watching a documentary on gravity, and there was a professor from MIT who said our bodies just aren't designed to be in zero gravity. They're designed to be in a gravity field like Earth's. So even modern scientists, I would assume someone from MIT would be more sympathetic to an argument like this. They can't help but speak in terms of final cause or purpose or design. And yet purpose is purposely excluded under the account of materialist evolution. To them, there are no real purposes in natural things, just the compounding of chance variations that are advantageous for survival, that perpetuate themselves in species through natural selection where only the strong survive, and this gives rise to the appearance of purpose, but nothing more. This is the essential mark of materialist evolution, and that the changes that happen to species are really the result of purposeless causes. That's what I mean when I say materialist evolution. There are lots of lines of evidence put forth in support of this sort of materialist evolution, and it's not just talk, folks. In the interest of time, I'll not list all of them, and my explanations will not be exhaustive. My purpose here is just to give you an idea of the strength of the case for some kind of evolution. So, first, the fossil record. While it's not unbroken, the fossil record suggests development of species in some cases. Older layers of sediment, called strata, are full of simpler organisms, and newer strata contain fossils of more and more complex creatures. It's often observed that each layer in such a sequence contains fossils that are distinct from the layers above or below. The organizing of these fossils chronologically seems to map out a progression and development among species similar in kind. Morphological change, to use the technical term. In the lineage of the horse, for example, various strata present a morphological sequence of small horse-like animals that have toed feet, and then slightly bigger horse-like animals that have hoofed feet. And so the thinking is that those are ancestors of the modern horse. And they lie in, the older layers have those small horse-like creatures, and the newer layers have things that look even more like the horse today. So that's very striking. Second, genetics. Various animals have similar genes. So for example, men and chickens and cows all have a gene for producing the molecule insulin. The thinking is that this section of the DNA molecule did not develop independently in each of these cases, but that a common ancestor possessed that gene, and it still is possessed by the various progeny today. So therefore, the more genes animals share in common, or the more similar their genes are, I guess I would say, the more closely they are related. And this is what is meant when it's said that humans share with chimpanzees, by some estimates, 98% of their DNA. Third, anatomy. The bone structures of many species are strikingly similar. A classic example of this is the human, dog, bird, and whale forelimbs. Though their limbs vary in shape, you can find a series of bone structures in which they all share the same structural function in the whole limb. And these are called homologous structures. You can also find vestigial structures in some creatures. Vestigial structures are things that may have once served some purpose, but they no longer do. in some given organism. So, for example, some snakes have vestigial legs, or whales have vestigial hind leg bones that don't even protrude from their skin anymore, or the tailbone in a human being would be another example of the vestigial structure. Fourth, the continental distribution of animals. Most mammals in Australia are marsupials, whereas most mammals in other parts of the world are placental. Darwin's finches and many species on the Hawaiian Islands are only found there, yet they're related to species back on the mainland. So the hypothesis is that the mainland species are ancestral to the Galapagos finches, or maybe the Galapagos finches and the mainland species both came from some common ancestor. I'm told that there are groups of plants and animals that are only found in the northern continents, and similarly there are groups of animals that are only found in the southern continents. So when looking at the Earth as a whole, animals in the same regions of the globe seem to be more closely related than animals that are from different parts of the globe. So it's construed that this distribution of animals is best explained by a combination of this evolution we're talking about, as well as tectonic plates shifting over the eons. Now, again, this is not meant to be a complete list of the evidence for an evolutionary account of nature, nor an exhaustive explanation of each. In my opinion, one has to be a biologist to truly appreciate the force of these arguments. But even as a layman, I am very struck by these arguments for some kind of evolution. On top of that, there are a couple of general reasons why I think some kind of evolution, or materialist evolution even, is intellectually attractive. First, it requires only a few principles, and they say that it explains the biodiversity of the Earth. And this should be appealing to anyone who's looking for the best explanation. Brevity is the soul of wit. Shakespeare, right? Yeah, so there's something inherently attractive and satisfying about an explanation which rests on the fewest principles. The second reason is a little more subtle. Because there are so few principles in this explanation, any further principles would be superfluous and unreasonable to suppose. This makes the theory appear to be a legitimate reason to discount a god or a creator from the account of nature and its origins. And I think this is the reason why evolution is so attractive in our secular society, and why it's so instinctively foreboding for a Christian. After all, if we grant evolution, then aren't we saying, well, we don't need God in our account of nature anymore? Now, there are those, like Bill Nye, who will state with utter conviction that evolution is a fact, that it is an undeniable fact, and that natural selection is absolutely sufficient to explain the biodiversity of our planet. But I think it would be going too far to say that there are no problems with the theory as I've just tried to summarize them. I'd like to share with you several of what I think are the more serious ones, and keep in mind that this list is just an overview, so my explanation will be very brief, but hopefully enough to give you a good idea of the potential problems with the materialist evolution account. So first, materialist evolution posits that species, as they get better and better at surviving, will become higher and higher forms of animals. But the problem with that is that higher form does not necessarily mean more fit for survival. So for example, a cockroach is better at surviving nuclear radiation than a human being is. But does that really mean that they are more perfect or a higher form of animal? Sea sponges are better at surviving underwater than dogs are, but no one would say a sea sponge is a higher form of animal than a dog. If the survival of the fittest really were the only principle in the development of species, then why aren't all living things just sea sponges and cockroaches and bacteria? While the theory offers a plausible account for successive generations becoming better and better at survival, there's no explanation for the degrees of perfection in animals, why they would develop into higher and higher animals, or even why one animal would be considered higher or more perfect than another animal. If you were going to try to explain that, you would need to include something like purpose or final cause, since that's the only way to say one thing is better than another. Think about two basketball players. If you say this guy's better, what does that mean? Well, it means he's better at fulfilling the purpose of a basketball player, which is to get the ball into the hoop. But of course, to discuss purpose with an inveterate materialist, Them's fighting words. Second, a key premise in the argument for materialist evolution is that, given a stable environment, species will eventually become so refined that they become a higher species. Let's think about that. Is there any reason to suppose that a species could become so perfect that they eventually become a new species? An easier example, I'm going to go back to the basketball player. Think of the best basketball player ever, better than Michael Jordan. As he eventually becomes so perfect, would he all of a sudden become a different kind of athlete? Doesn't seem likely. Dribbling's not a very good skill in football. Or what if a man were to become as perfect as he could be? Would he be more prone to turn into a beast? Of course not. In fact, it seems even less likely that he would be prone to becoming more bestial. It's when things are less perfect that they seem more similar and maybe easier to change. The embryos of various animals look more similar than the adults of their respective species. The seed of a lemon tree is hard to tell apart from the seed of an orange tree, but once they've grown, then it's not difficult at all. So this is the very opposite premise that was given in the argument. The premise of the materialist evolution is that as something becomes more and more perfect, it's going to become something else. But our experience says that as things become more and more perfect, they're more firmly what they are, and less likely to change. So third, remember that the mechanism of materialist evolution is survival of the fittest, meaning that advantageous traits are passed along to the progeny. They're going to become more pronounced and develop into new organs or even into a new species and all the rest of it. But this mechanism assumes one very important trait, and it's the only trait that cannot be developed through a series of progeny. That's the ability to reproduce. If you don't have the ability to reproduce, then your species can forget about passing along new traits to your descendants. Some further account or mechanism would have to be posited to explain the origin of life and the ability of living things to reproduce. And I think this makes natural selection and survival of the fittest much less sufficient principles of the origin of species than they may at first seem. A fourth difficulty with materialist evolution is the idea that some organs have many parts and offer no advantage to the organism unless all the parts are there and working together at the same time. Consider an eye. It has many parts necessary to function correctly. You need a lens, you need a retina, you need an optic nerve, etc. If any one of those parts is missing, then the eyeball will not work, and I don't see how it would be advantageous for anything. Organs like this are said to be irreducibly complex, and this seems to me to be a real difficulty for evolution. Apparently Darwin considered this objection too, and I'll quote him here. If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed, which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. But this is interesting. I can find no such case. I very much wonder what he would have thought of the eye, or the ear, or the brain. If the eye and its many parts were developed over many generations, what function were each of those parts accomplishing as they slowly developed into a finally working eye? Remember, only traits that are advantageous for survival are going to be passed on to later generations. And the lens by itself, or the optic nerve by itself, or the retina by itself, it doesn't offer any survival advantage. So they would have been something like useless appendages while they were developing into a functioning eyeball. And finally, what seems to me to be the most serious objection with materialist evolution is that it undermines our ability to make sense of the world. Science takes it as an axiom that the